Sarah could no longer feel her fingertips or toes. The bitter cold had long since penetrated her inadequate clothing, turning her extremities into numb appendages that she commanded through memory rather than sensation. 17 doors. 17 rejections, if one could even call them that. Most hadn't acknowledged her presence at all. The buildings stood like mausoleums in this dead city, their inhabitants either gone or so deeply ensconced in survival that another's plight registered as nothing more than a potential threat to their own tenuous existence. The snowfall had intensified in the last hour, thick flakes swirling in the harsh wind that cut through the abandoned streets. The city itself seemed frozen in time, a monument to what had been before the collapse. Tall structures of metal and composite materials loomed overhead, their surfaces coated with ice that refracted what little light remained in this perpetual twilight. The atmosphere processors had failed 3 cycles ago, plunging this settlement into an artificial winter that showed no signs of abating. Sarah's legs moved forward on autopilot, her consciousness retreating inward to escape the reality of her situation. She had crash-landed 2 days ago after her emergency pod was damaged entering the planet's turbulent atmosphere. The ship and its crew, her family in every way that mattered, were gone, scattered in the upper atmosphere like metallic confetti. She alone had survived, though survival seemed a generous term for her current state. The 17th door had been like all the others, metal, rusted at the edges, with a small viewport that had briefly illuminated with light before darkening again. She hadn't even heard movement from within, just silence, that terrible silence that seemed to define this place. No birds, no insects, no machinery humming, just the howl of wind and occasionally the distant crack of ice sheets shifting. Sarah had not expected to reach an 18th door. Her path through the desolate streets had been dictated less by hope and more by the desperate, primal drive to find warmth before her body simply stopped functioning. The building before her was unremarkable, identical to the others she had approached, a towering monolith of metal and composite materials, windows darkened or boarded, exterior stained with the evidence of neglect and harsh weather. With hands she could barely control, Sarah raised her fist to the door. The impact was so slight that she wondered if she had imagined making contact at all. No sound seemed to carry from the feeble attempt. She tried again, putting the last reserves of her strength into the motion. The dull thud that resulted was barely audible even to her own ears, lost almost immediately in the keening of the wind that snaked through the empty streets and alleyways like a hungry predator. The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by her labored breathing that emerged as pale clouds in the frigid air. Sarah slumped against the door, her forehead coming to rest against the cold metal. She closed her eyes. Perhaps this was it. Perhaps this was where her journey ended, not among the stars as she had always imagined, but against an anonymous door in a dead city on a dying world. Time stretched, elastic, and meaningless. She might have stood there for minutes or hours, consciousness ebbing and flowing like a tide. The sound that finally broke through her stupor was so unexpected that at first she thought she had imagined it. A mechanical clicking, the sound of locks disengaging. The door moved inward so suddenly that Sarah, still leaning against it, nearly fell into the space beyond. A rush of comparatively warmer air brushed against her face, carrying with it the scent of dust, metal, and something else, something living. In the dim light, she could just make out a figure standing in the doorway. Tall, lean, unmistakably human despite the thick layers of clothing that obscured most features. For a long moment, neither moved. Sarah stared up at the figure, too weak to speak, too disoriented to feel fear. The figure, a man, she realized as her eyes adjusted, made no move to help her. He simply stood, one hand still on the door, the other holding what appeared to be some kind of modified weapon. His face remained in shadow beneath a hood, but she could feel his gaze upon her, assessing, calculating. Inside, he finally said, his voice rough with disuse. Quickly, Sarah didn't need to be told twice. Using the doorframe for support, She pulled herself over the threshold. The man immediately closed the door behind her, engaging a complex series of locks that spoke of paranoia and years of conditioning. The room was dark, lit only by a faint blue glow emanating from what must have been a power source in the corner. It was sparse. A few pieces of salvaged furniture, walls lined with storage containers, tools and equipment arranged with meticulous precision. The man moved past her, without a word, crossing to a panel on the wall. He manipulated several controls, and a soft humming filled the space as heating elements concealed within the walls began to activate. "Don't touch anything," he said, still not looking at her directly. "Just stand there until I say otherwise." Sarah complied, too exhausted and grateful for the shelter to do anything else. She watched as the man secured the space, checking viewports, adjusting settings on various equipment, all while keeping her in his peripheral vision. His movements were efficient, practiced, those of someone who had developed routines to manage fear rather than eliminate it. "Thank you," Sarah managed to say, her voice barely above a whisper. The man paused, as if surprised by the sound of her voice. He glanced her way, his face briefly caught in the blue light. His features were sharp, angular, his skin pale from lack of sunlight. A scar ran from his left temple down to his jawline, old and silver in the dim light. His eyes, when they met hers, were a startling shade of gray that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. "Don't thank me yet," he replied, turning back to his tasks. "I haven't decided if letting you in was a mistake." Gideon hadn't spoken to another person in 743 days. He kept count, marking each passing day with a small notch on a metal panel near his sleeping area. It wasn't out of sentimentality or even to maintain his sanity. It was data, and data was valuable in a world where patterns meant survival and anomalies meant potential threats. Today had produced an anomaly. He watched the woman. Alien, he corrected himself mentally, though she appeared remarkably human, as she stood where he'd instructed, swaying slightly with exhaustion. Her skin had a faint bluish undertone that might have been from the cold or might have been her natural coloration. It was difficult to tell in the dim light. Her hair, cropped close to her skull, was an unusual silver white that seemed to absorb and reflect the blue illumination in equal measure. Her eyes, when she had briefly looked at him, had contained an extra membrane, a thin, translucent shield that had slid sideways across her iris when she blinked. Not human, but close. One of the near-human species that had integrated with Earth's expansion before the collapse. Before everything went to hell, Gideon hadn't intended to open the door. He had been in his workshop area, repairing a water reclamation unit that had begun to show signs of failure when he'd first heard the sound. Initially, he dismissed it as another settling of the building, or perhaps debris blown against the exterior by the perpetual storm. It wasn't until the sound repeated that something, instinct perhaps, or some long-dormant sense of connection, had compelled him to check the security feed. The woman had appeared more dead than alive, leaning against his door as though it were the only thing keeping her upright. And perhaps it was. The temperature outside had dropped to lethal levels, and she wore nothing that would adequately protect against such conditions. She should have been dead already. His first impulse had been to ignore her, as he had ignored the few other desperate souls who had occasionally found their way to his door in the early days after he'd claimed this space. Those encounters had taught him that compassion was a luxury he couldn't afford, not when resources were finite and trust was a liability. Yet something about this woman, the way she stood without pleading, without beating on the door or calling out, as though she had already accepted her fate, had triggered something in him. A memory, perhaps, of when he had been the one at the mercy of elements and circumstance. Or perhaps it was simpler than that. Perhaps, after 743 days of solitude, some essential part of him had recognized that he was no longer merely surviving, but slowly dying by inches, his humanity eroding with each passing day of isolation. Whatever the reason, he had opened the door, and now she stood in his sanctuary, a living, breathing variable in the careful equation of his existence. "You can sit," he said finally, gesturing to a metal crate near the heating element. You need to warm up gradually. Too much heat too quickly will damage your tissue. The woman, he would need to ask her name, he realized, another sign of how far he'd drifted from social norms, nodded and carefully made her way to the crate. Her movements were stiff, uncoordinated, confirming his suspicion that she was in the early stages of hypothermia. "Thank you," she said again, her voice slightly stronger now. "I didn't think anyone would." "Don't," Gideon interrupted. "Don't make this into something it's not. I opened the door. That's all. Once you're stable, you'll go." The lie felt hollow even as he spoke it. Where'd she go in this weather? Back to the frozen streets? To knock on another door that would likely remain closed? He pushed the thought aside, one problem at a time. First, ensure she didn't die in his living space. Then decide what to do with her. He moved to a storage container and extracted a thermal blanket, one of a precious few he had salvaged from an abandoned medical facility months ago. He tossed it to her, careful to maintain distance between them. "Cover yourself with that. It'll help regulate your temperature." He paused, then added, almost as an afterthought, "What's your name?" The woman wrapped the blanket around her shoulders, her movements becoming more fluid as warmth began to return to her limbs. "Sarah," she replied. "My name is Sarah." Gideon nodded, acknowledging the information without offering his own name in return. Names created connections, and connections created vulnerabilities. He had already allowed one breach in his defenses today. He wouldn't compound the error. He returned to the water reclamation unit, picking up the tools he had abandoned when he'd heard her knock. The familiar routine of repair work would help center him, allow him to think through this unexpected development while keeping his hands busy. "I'll be gone by morning," Sarah said after a long silence, as though reading his thoughts. "Once I can feel my extremities again. I won't be a burden." Gideon didn't look up from his work. "Where will you go?" The question surprised them both. He hadn't meant to ask it, hadn't meant to express even that minimal level of interest in her circumstances. Yet there it was, hanging in the air between them. Sarah was quiet for so long that he thought she might not answer. When she finally did, her voice was flat, devoid of either hope or despair. "I don't know. My transport crashed. Everyone else is dead. I don't even know what this place is called." "It doesn't have a name anymore," Gideon replied, focusing intently on a particularly stubborn connector that refused to seal properly. "At least, not one that matters. It used to be New Copenhagen, Sector 7 of the Northern Expansion. Now it's just here. One more dead zone on a planet full of them." He felt rather than saw her nod, accepting this information with the resigned practicality of someone who had already calculated the dire nature of her situation. "The atmosphere processors failed," he continued, unsure why he was volunteering information. 3 cycles ago. Without them, the terraforming began to reverse. Temperature dropped. Storms increased. Most people evacuated. Those who couldn't or wouldn't, well, they died." Sarah finished for him. "Yes." Another silence fell, this one heavier than the last. Gideon focused on his repair work, hyper-aware of the stranger in his space, but unwilling to acknowledge how profoundly her presence had already disrupted his carefully constructed isolation. The soft sound of her breathing, the slight shifts of movement as she adjusted the thermal blanket, each was an intrusion, a reminder of what he had deliberately excised from his life. "Why did you stay?" Sarah asked eventually. Gideon's hands stilled over the reclamation unit. It was the obvious question, yet he had no ready answer. Or rather, he had too many answers, none of which he was prepared to share with this stranger. "It's complicated," he said finally, the words inadequate but all he was willing to offer. Sarah didn't press. Instead, she said, "My people have a saying, the lone traveler sees the path but misses the landscape. I never understood it until now." Gideon resumed his work, not responding to what seemed like an oblique commentary on his chosen solitude. Yet the words lingered, worming their way into his thoughts with irritating persistence. "You should rest," he said after completing the repair and testing the unit's functionality. "There's a sleeping pod in the alcove. It's clean." Sarah looked toward where he had indicated, then back at him, wariness evident in her posture. "And where will you sleep?" The question carried undertones of concern that made Gideon almost uncomfortable. It had been so long since anyone had considered his well-being, even in such a basic way, that he hardly knew how to respond. "I have another," he lied. In truth, he would take the floor, as he had no intention of sleeping while a stranger occupied his space. "Go. Rest. We'll figure out the rest tomorrow." Sarah hesitated, then nodded, rising slowly from the crate. "Thank you," she said for the third time, the words simple but weighted. "For opening the door." Gideon turned away, unable to meet her gaze. "18th time's a charm, I guess," he muttered, the attempt at humor so rusty it emerged more as a growl. To his surprise, Sarah produced a soft sound that might have been a laugh. "So it would seem," she agreed, before making her way toward the sleeping pod. Gideon watched her go, a curious emptiness expanding in his chest. 743 days of carefully constructed solitude, and in less than an hour, this stranger had already begun to dismantle it, brick by brick, word by word. He turned back to his workbench, reaching for another project, another distraction. But for the first time in a very long time, the familiar routine brought no comfort. His sanctuary had been breached, and with it, the careful walls he had built around the ruins of his former self. The 18th door had opened. He just wasn't sure if he had let something in, or if something within him had finally found its way out. Sarah woke to unfamiliar surroundings, momentary panic gripping her until memory returned. The crash, the cold, the desperate journey through empty streets. The 18th door. The sleeping pod was utilitarian but efficient, its environmental controls having maintained a perfect temperature throughout her rest. How long had she slept? The absence of natural light made it impossible to tell. Her body, however, told her it had been substantial. The bone-deep fatigue had receded, and feeling had returned to her extremities, though her muscles ached with the aftermath of exposure. She sat up slowly, listening. The living space beyond the alcove was quiet, but not empty. She could sense the presence of her reluctant host, Gideon. She had heard him mutter to himself while working, a steady energy that radiated focus and wariness in equal measure. Sarah took a moment to assess herself. Her clothes had dried while she slept, though they remained woefully inadequate for the environmental conditions of this planet. Her internal systems had stabilized. The emergency hibernation protocols her body had initiated during extreme cold exposure now fully disengaged. She would survive. For now. With careful movements, she emerged from the alcove. The main living area was slightly brighter than it had been previously, illuminated now by both the blue power source and several small LED lights strategically placed around the perimeter. The space revealed itself more fully in this improved lighting. A single room, approximately 8 meters square, divided into functional areas through the arrangement of salvaged furniture and equipment. Gideon sat at what appeared to be a communication station, though the equipment had been extensively modified. He didn't look up as she entered, but his posture shifted slightly, acknowledging her presence while maintaining his focus on whatever data scrolled across the screen before him. Sarah remained where she was, unwilling to enter further into his territory without invitation. She used the moment to observe him more thoroughly than she had been able to in her compromised state the night before. He was tall, as she had noted previously, with the lean musculature of someone who survived on minimal sustenance but engaged in regular physical activity. His hair was dark, cut irregularly as though he'd done it himself with little concern for appearance. The scar on his face was more pronounced in this lighting, a jagged line that spoke of violence and inadequate medical care. His hands moved over the equipment with practiced precision, long fingers manipulating controls with an engineer's familiarity. "There's protein compound in the storage unit to your right," Gideon said suddenly, still not looking at her, "and water in the dispenser beside it. You'll need to rehydrate after exposure." Sarah blinked, surprised by the offer. "Thank you," she said, moving carefully toward the indicated storage unit. The protein compound was standard emergency rations, flavorless but nutritionally complete. The water, when she tried it, was remarkably pure, suggesting that the reclamation unit Gideon had been repairing was quite sophisticated. She consumed both while standing, maintaining her position near the alcove, respecting the invisible boundaries that seemed to crisscross the living space like tripwires. Gideon continued to work, or at least appear to work. Sarah suspected he was actually monitoring her through peripheral vision and reflected surfaces, assessing her every movement for potential threat. "Your equipment," she said finally, breaking the heavy silence. "It's Federation tech, but heavily modified." Gideon's hands paused momentarily over the console. "You know Federation technology?" "I was a systems specialist on the Artemis," Sarah replied, "before the crash." This information seemed to interest him enough to finally turn and face her directly. "The Artemis? A research vessel?" Sarah nodded. "We were mapping atmosphere degeneration patterns across the outer sectors, trying to predict which colonies would be affected next, establish evacuation protocols." "Fat lot of good that did," Gideon muttered, turning back to his console. "We were too late for some," Sarah acknowledged, refusing to take offense at his bitterness. "But we managed to evacuate 3 settlements before you crashed here," Gideon finished for her. "Ironic." "Yes," Sarah agreed quietly. "Ironic." Silence fell again, but something had shifted. A fragment of information exchanged, a common reference point established. The smallest foundation of communication laid between 2 strangers in a hostile world. Sarah finished the protein compound and water, then looked around for somewhere to dispose of the container. Noting her dilemma, Gideon gestured to a small recycling unit near his workstation. She approached cautiously, depositing the container in the unit, which hummed briefly as it processed the material. "Your reclamation systems are impressive," she observed, keeping her tone neutral, technical. "You've maintained functionality despite the infrastructure collapse." Gideon shrugged, but she could sense a certain pride beneath the nonchalant gesture. "Necessity." The building's original systems were damaged in the riots after the atmosphere processors failed. "I've been salvaging compatible parts, adapting what I could." "You're an engineer?" Sarah asked, genuinely curious. "I was a lot of things," Gideon replied, cryptically. "Before." He stood abruptly, moving to a storage container on the far side of the room. After rummaging briefly, he extracted a bundle of fabric which he tossed in her direction. Sarah caught it reflexively. "Thermal layers," he explained. "They'll protect against the cold better than what you're wearing. They're designed for humans, but they should fit well enough." Sarah examined the garments. A base layer made of some synthetic material that would reflect body heat, an insulated mid-layer, and an outer shell designed to repel moisture and wind. All were worn but serviceable, and indeed better than anything she currently possessed. "Thank you," she said, genuinely touched by the unexpected generosity. I'd be grateful to use these." Gideon nodded once, then turned back to his console, clearly indicating the interaction was over for now. Sarah took the garments back to the sleeping alcove to change, appreciating both the improved protection they would provide and the privacy afforded by his deliberate attention elsewhere. The next days, 3 of them, marked by Gideon's methodical notches on the metal panel, established a pattern of coexistence built on minimal interaction and careful observation. They orbited each other in the confined space like cautious satellites, never colliding but acutely aware of each other's movements and routines. Gideon continued his endless projects, repairing equipment, monitoring communications frequencies that rarely produced anything but static, maintaining the complex systems that kept his sanctuary habitable. Sarah, after initially offering assistance and being curtly refused, found ways to make herself useful without intruding. She reorganized storage containers for more efficient access, improved the water filtration system with a modification she recalled from her time on the Artemis, and twice prepared meals from their limited supplies that were marginally more palatable than the standard protein compounds. They spoke little. When they did, it was primarily about practical matters, the functioning of equipment, the allocation of resources, the steadily worsening weather conditions outside. Occasionally, a fragment of more personal information would slip through, usually in the context of explaining a particular skill or knowledge base. Sarah learned that Gideon had once worked for a planetary engineering corporation, specializing in terraforming maintenance. Gideon discovered that Sarah's species, though similar to humans in appearance, had evolved on a world with higher gravity and lower oxygen content, giving her greater physical strength and endurance, but requiring more frequent rest cycles. Neither asked the obvious questions about past lives, lost connections, or future plans. Such topics seemed to exist in a quarantined zone of conversation, too potentially infectious to breach the fragile equilibrium they had established. Instead, they communicated most clearly through actions and observations. Sarah noted how Gideon always checked the security feeds before approaching any exterior-facing section of the living space, a habit born of past danger. Gideon observed how Sarah would occasionally close her inner eyelids and remain motionless for several minutes, a meditation technique her people use to process stress and trauma. Neither commented on these behaviors, yet each accumulated such details, building a wordless understanding of the other's boundaries and needs. On the fourth day, the equilibrium shattered with the sound of an explosion. It came from outside, not close enough to damage their shelter, but near enough to rattle the few unsecured items in the living space. Gideon, who had been at his workbench disassembling a malfunctioning heater coil, moved with startling speed to the security console. "Scavengers," he said, his voice tight as he examined the exterior. "Feeds. A group of them, moving through the sector. They're using sonic charges to breach sealed buildings." Sarah joined him at the console, careful to maintain a respectful distance. The feed showed grainy images of six figures moving through the snow-covered streets, their forms distorted by heavy weather gear and the equipment they carried. Even through the poor quality of the image, their movements conveyed practiced efficiency and purpose. "They're systematic," she observed. "This isn't random looting." Gideon's jaw tightened. "No, they're professionals. Probably contracted by one of the resource cartels still operating in the habitable zones. They strip abandoned settlements for any valuable tech or materials, then move on." "Will they come here?" Sarah asked, studying the pattern of the scavengers' movements. "Eventually," Gideon replied grimly. "They're working their way through the sector building by building. It's just a matter of time." Sarah processed this information, quickly calculating options. "We could hide. This building has multiple levels. Surely there are spaces they wouldn't bother to check thoroughly." Gideon shook his head. "They use bioscanners. Standard procedure for resource teams. They're looking for survivors who might be hoarding valuable materials." He hesitated, then added, "or who might be valuable themselves." The implication hung in the air between them. In a resource-depleted world, skilled individuals, engineers, medical personnel, even those with physical attributes useful for labor, were commodities to be captured and exploited. "How long do we have?" Sarah asked, shifting seamlessly into crisis assessment mode, her training from the Artemis taking over. Gideon studied the scavengers' progress. "At their current pace, maybe 12 hours. Less if they decide to change their search pattern." Sarah nodded, her mind racing through possibilities. "You must have contingency plans. You've survived here for over 2 years. This can't be the first time scavengers have come through the sector." Gideon was silent for a moment, his expression unreadable. Then, with obvious reluctance, he moved to what appeared to be a solid section of wall near his sleeping area. He placed his palm against a specific point, and a hidden panel slid aside, revealing a narrow passage beyond. "Maintenance tunnel," he explained tersely. "Runs between the structural walls, connects to the building's original emergency evacuation system. I've modified it, created a safe room 10 levels down that doesn't appear on any building schematics. It's shielded against standard bioscans." Sarah examined the opening with a professional eye. Smart, but tight quarters for 2 people. "It wasn't designed for 2. Gideon pointed out, the implication clear. This was his escape route, his insurance policy. Sharing it represented a significant breach of his self-imposed isolation. Sarah met his gaze directly. "Understand," she said quietly. "This is your sanctuary. I'm an unexpected complication." Gideon looked away, his expression troubled. We need to prepare. If we're going to use the safe room, we need to move essential supplies now, before the scavengers get close enough to detect the activity. The use of "we" didn't escape Sarah's notice, but she made no comment on it. Instead, she asked, "What can I do to help?" For the next several hours, they worked with focused efficiency, gathering critical supplies and moving them in stages through the narrow maintenance tunnel to the safe room below. The space, when Sarah finally saw it, was indeed small, barely 4 meters square, but ingeniously equipped. Gideon had created a self-contained environment with independent air filtration, water reclamation, and power systems. A small arsenal of weaponry was secured in one corner, alongside communications equipment more sophisticated than what he maintained in the main living area. "You've been planning for something worse than scavengers," Sarah observed as they arranged the final supplies. Gideon's expression darkened. "Scavengers are just the beginning. The resource cartels are getting desperate as more settlements fail. There are rumors of conscription teams rounding up anyone with useful skills, pressing them into service in the megacities that still function. Is that why you stay hidden?" Sarah asked. "To avoid conscription? That's part of it," Gideon admitted, checking a power cell with unnecessary thoroughness. "The corporations that run the megacities, they're the same ones that ignored the warning signs about the atmosphere processors. The same ones that cut corners on maintenance, that prioritize profit over sustainability. They created this collapse. I'll die before I help them build their privileged enclaves while the rest of the planet freezes." The vehemence in his voice revealed more about his past than any direct explanation could have. Sarah recognized the tone of someone who had witnessed corporate malfeasance firsthand, who had perhaps even been complicit in it before understanding the consequences. "On the Artemis," she said carefully, "we discovered evidence that the atmosphere degradation wasn't just negligence. At least, not entirely. There were deliberate adjustments made to the processor protocols in certain sectors, adjustments that accelerated cooling in areas deemed economically non-viable." Gideon's head snapped up, his eyes narrowing. "You have proof of this?" Sarah hesitated. "I had data. It was in the ship's secure systems, which crashed with the Artemis," Gideon finished, disappointment evident in his tone. "Yes," Sarah confirmed. "But—" She stopped, unsure whether to share what might be her only leverage in this uncertain alliance. Gideon waited, sensing her hesitation. "But what?" he prompted when she didn't continue. Sarah made her decision. "But I managed to transfer some of the critical data to a secure implant before evacuation. It's fragmentary, not the complete evidence, but enough to establish a pattern. Enough to prove intentional action rather than mere negligence." Gideon stared at her, reassessing everything about her presence. "You've been carrying this information all this time, while knocking on doors, risking death in the cold." "It's why I need to survive," Sarah said simply. "This information needs to reach the right people. There are still independent settlements, outposts not controlled by the megacity corporations. They need to know what they're dealing with." The revelation hung between them, altering the dynamic of their fragile alliance. Sarah had just identified herself as more than a random survivor. She was a carrier of potentially dangerous information, a target for forces far more concerning than random scavengers. Before Gideon could respond, an alarm sounded from the communication device on his wrist. He activated it quickly, checking the feed. "The scavengers have changed their pattern," he said, his voice tense. "They're heading directly this way. Someone must have tipped them off about this location." "How long?" Sarah asked, immediately shifting back into crisis mode. "Minutes, not hours," Gideon replied, already moving toward the tunnel entrance. "We need to get back up and seal this location before they arrive. If they find the tunnel entrance—" He didn't need to finish the thought. If the scavengers discovered his hidden network, the safe room would become a trap rather than a sanctuary. They moved quickly through the maintenance tunnel, emerging back into the main living area. Gideon immediately went to the security feeds, while Sarah gathered the few remaining essential items they had planned to bring to the safe room. 6 of them, Gideon reported tersely. Heavy equipment. Definitely not a random sweep. They're coming specifically for this location. Sarah joined him at the console, studying the images. They're too coordinated for standard scavengers, she observed. Look at their formation, the way they're covering approaches. Gideon's expression hardened. Military training, or ex-military working for the corporations now. He turned to her, suspicion darkening his features. Is this about you? Are they tracking you somehow? Sarah shook her head firmly. No, my emergency transponder was damaged in the crash, and the data implant is shielded specifically to prevent remote detection. Then why? Gideon began, but was cut off by another alarm. One of the scavengers had placed a device against the building's exterior wall, a sonic charge designed to breach the structure's integrity. No time, Gideon said, abandoning the question in favor of immediate action. We need to seal the tunnel entrance and get below. They worked with desperate speed, hiding any evidence of their presence, eliminating traces of Sarah's existence in the living space. As they prepared to enter the tunnel, a final alarm sounded, proximity alerts indicating the scavengers had reached the outer door. Gideon cursed under his breath, grabbing a weapon from a hidden compartment. Go, he urged Sarah. Get to the safe room. Seal yourself in. The access code is 7294. I'm not leaving you here, Sarah protested, reaching for one of the remaining weapons. This isn't a discussion, Gideon snapped. The data you're carrying is too important. If they're who I think they are, they'll kill us both without hesitation to get it. All the more reason we stay together, Sarah insisted, checking the weapon's charge. 2 defenders are better than 1. Before Gideon could argue further, a tremendous boom echoed through the living space. The outer door had been breached. They were out of time. Tunnel. Now, Gideon ordered, moving to a defensive position with clear sight lines to the entry point. Sarah didn't move. Damn it, Sarah, Gideon hissed. This isn't the time for... They'll expect the tunnel, she interrupted, her voice calm despite the circumstances. It's standard emergency architecture in these buildings. They'll find it no matter how well we hide the entrance. Gideon knew she was right, though he was loath to admit it. Then what do you suggest? Sarah's gaze moved to the ceiling. They'll be looking down for hidden exits, not up. Following her line of sight, Gideon understood immediately. The environmental control housing above them, designed to be accessible for maintenance, offered a concealment space barely large enough for 2 people. It wouldn't fool bioscans, but if the scavengers relied primarily on visual inspection, it might work, he conceded. But if it doesn't, we have no secondary escape route. Another crash sounded, closer now. The scavengers had breached the second security door. No time for debate, Sarah said, already moving a storage unit beneath the access panel. Help me with this. Together, they quickly created a makeshift ladder. Sarah climbed first, demonstrating the superior strength of her species as she easily pulled herself into the narrow maintenance space. Gideon followed, just managing to secure the access panel behind them as the inner door to his living quarters burst open. From their concealed position, they had a limited view through the ventilation slats. 6 figures in heavy tactical gear poured into the room, weapons raised. Their movements were coordinated, professional, clearing corners, checking potential hiding spots with methodical precision. Thermal signatures indicate recent occupation. One of them announced consulting a handheld device. 2 individuals. 1 human, 1 unidentified species. Check for hidden exits. Ordered another figure, clearly the leader. Standard protocols. Look for maintenance access ways, security passages, anything that could provide escape routes. As predicted, the scavengers quickly located the tunnel entrance despite Gideon's attempts to conceal it. 4 of them disappeared inside, while 2 remained to search the main living area. Sarah and Gideon remained motionless in their cramped hiding space, barely breathing. The environmental control housing was designed to dampen sound from the machinery within, providing some insulation against detection, but any significant movement risked giving away their position. One of the remaining scavengers moved directly beneath them, close enough that Sarah could see the corporate insignia on his tactical gear. Nexus Corp, one of the megacity conglomerates notorious for exploitative practices in the outer sectors. Command, this is Extraction Team Delta. The leader spoke into a communication device. Target location secured, but subjects not found. Evidence of recent evacuation. Proceeding with secondary search protocols. The response was too quiet for Sarah to hear, but the leader's reaction was visible. A stiffening of posture, a subtle shift toward greater alertness. Understood, Command. Implementing bioscan sweep. Sarah tensed. Standard bioscans would detect them instantly, even through the housing material. She glanced at Gideon, who had reached the same conclusion. His hand moved to his weapon, ready for the inevitable confrontation. Just as the leader reached for an advanced scanning device on his belt, a distant explosion rocked the building, causing dust to rain down from the ceiling. The two scavengers immediately shifted their attention to the source of the disturbance. Team 2, report. The leader barked into his communicator. Static was the only response. Team 2, acknowledge. When no response came, the leader signaled to his remaining companion. Possible hostiles in the lower levels. We move now. Without further discussion, they exited the living area, heading in the direction of the tunnel entrance. The moment they disappeared from view, Gideon hissed. That was the safe room's security measures. They must have triggered the proximity charges. Those won't hold them for long, Sarah whispered back. We need to move while they're distracted. Gideon nodded, carefully removing the access panel. They descended quickly, both scanning the living area for any remaining threats. What's the plan? Sarah asked, retrieving her weapon from where she'd concealed it before their hasty retreat to the ceiling. The plan was the safe room, Gideon replied tersely, gathering additional supplies with practiced efficiency. That's no longer viable. We need to evacuate completely. To where? You said yourself the environment outside is lethal. Gideon moved to a storage container she hadn't seen him access before, entering a complex security code. The container opened to reveal environmental suits, not the standard emergency gear distributed during the evacuation, but military-grade protection systems capable of withstanding extreme conditions. I've been preparing for this possibility, he explained, removing 2 suits. There's an old research facility 3 sectors from. Here, abandoned early in the collapse, but its core infrastructure was designed to operate autonomously. If it's still functioning, it could provide better shelter than this place ever did. Sarah took the suit he offered, examining its sophisticated systems. You've never mentioned this before. I've never had to evacuate before, Gideon countered, beginning to don his own suit. And I wasn't sure I could trust you with the information. Sarah paused in her preparations, meeting his gaze directly. And now, Gideon's expression was complex, emotions warring beneath the surface of his carefully maintained detachment. Now I don't have much choice, do I? Besides, your data on the atmospheric sabotage. If true, it confirms suspicions I've had for years. It's too important to lose. It wasn't exactly a declaration of trust, but it was the closest thing to it she'd received since arriving at his door. Sarah nodded, accepting the limited alliance for what it was, and continued preparing her suit. Another explosion, closer this time, spurred them to greater speed. Within minutes, they were both encased in the protective gear, weapons secured in exterior holsters, portable supply packs attached to their suits' utility systems. There's a maintenance exit on the east side of the building, Gideon explained, leading the way toward what appeared to be a solid wall. It's not on any official schematics. I created it myself after the evacuation, when it became clear scavengers would eventually sweep through the sector. He placed his hand against a particular section of wall, and a hidden panel slid aside, revealing a narrow corridor beyond. This leads to a service shaft that will take us to street level. From there, we'll have to move quickly. The storm outside will provide some cover from visual detection, but they'll be using advanced tracking systems. Sarah nodded, mentally preparing for the challenge ahead. How far to the research facility? 18 kilometers, Gideon replied. On foot, in these conditions? 6 to 8 hours if we push hard and don't encounter complications. Both knew the likelihood of avoiding complications was virtually non-existent, but neither saw any benefit in stating the obvious. Instead, they performed final checks on each other's equipment, ensuring seals were secure and systems functioning properly. "Ready?" Gideon asked, his voice slightly distorted through the suit's communication system. Sarah nodded, her expression resolute behind the transparent faceplate. "Lead the way." Gideon activated the hidden passage, and together they slipped into the narrow corridor, leaving behind the sanctuary that had been both prison and protection. As the panel sealed shut behind them, erasing any evidence of their escape route, Sarah felt a peculiar sense of finality. Whatever happened next, there would be no returning to the fragile equilibrium they had established over the past few days. The corridor was pitch black, forcing them to rely on the suit's integrated lighting systems. Gideon moved with confidence, having clearly traversed this route before, while Sarah followed closely, alert for any sounds of pursuit. The passage twisted through the building's structural supports, occasionally requiring them to crawl through particularly narrow sections. After what felt like an eternity of claustrophobic navigation, they reached a vertical shaft fitted with maintenance rungs. Gideon gestured upward, and they began to climb, the physical exertion causing their suit temperature regulation systems to activate. 3 levels up, Gideon paused at a juncture, accessing a concealed panel that revealed a small chamber beyond. "Emergency equipment cache," he explained, retrieving several devices Sarah didn't recognize. "Signal jammers, primarily. They won't stop the scavengers from tracking us completely, but they'll degrade their systems enough to give us a fighting chance." He distributed the devices between them, explaining their operation in terse, efficient phrases. Sarah absorbed the information quickly, impressed despite the circumstances by the thoroughness of his preparations. Gideon had clearly been planning for catastrophic scenarios long before her arrival had precipitated one. They continued upward, eventually reaching a heavily reinforced hatch. Gideon paused, checking readings on his suit's environmental monitors. "External temperature is minus 42 degrees Celsius, he reported. "Wind speed at 38 knots, gusting to 50. Visibility approximately 15 meters. Not ideal, but we've got no choice." He entered a security code into the hatch mechanism, then braced himself as the seal released with a hydraulic hiss. Wind immediately howled through the opening, bringing with it a swirl of snow and ice particles that sparkled in the beams of their suit lights. Gideon pulled himself up and out, then reached back to assist Sarah, though her enhanced strength made such aid unnecessary. She accepted the gesture nonetheless, recognizing it as an unconscious signal of their evolving alliance. The world outside was a frozen wasteland, barely recognizable as a once thriving settlement. Snow had drifted against abandoned vehicles and building fronts, creating smooth, sculptural forms that glowed faintly blue in the perpetual twilight. The wind carved patterns in the snow's surface, erasing footprints almost as quickly as they were made, an advantage for their escape, but also a hazard that would make navigation challenging. Gideon activated a heads-up display in his helmet, which projected a route overlay on his faceplate. "We head east initially," he said through the comm system. "Through the commercial district. It's more exposed, but the alternatives involve choke points we can't risk if we're being pursued." Sarah nodded, scanning their surroundings for any sign of the scavengers. The storm's ferocity would hamper conventional surveillance, but she had no illusions about the technological capabilities of Nexus Corp's extraction teams. Their pursuit would be relentless, methodical, and backed by resources neither she nor Gideon could match. "Let's move," she said, adjusting her weapon for easier access. "The sooner we put distance between us and this location, the better our chances." They set off at a pace that balanced speed with caution, moving from cover to cover where possible, exposed only when absolutely necessary. The suit's thermal regulation systems worked efficiently against the extreme cold, but the physical exertion of navigating through deep snow and icy debris was taxing. Sarah found herself grateful for her species' enhanced endurance, and concerned for Gideon, who, despite his evident fitness, would face greater physiological challenges in these conditions. They had covered perhaps 2 kilometers when the first signs of pursuit materialized. A faint but distinctive humming sound carried through the storm. The signature of repulsor engines, technology too advanced for common scavengers. Nexus Corp had deployed aerial drones. Down, Gideon hissed through the calm, pulling Sarah into the shelter of a collapsed storefront. They pressed themselves against the remains of a wall as the humming intensified, then passed overhead. They're using thermal imaging sweeps. The storm will degrade their effectiveness, but not enough to hide us completely. Sarah processed this information quickly, mind racing through potential countermeasures. The signal jammers you brought, she said, could they be modified to emit false thermal signatures? Create decoys. Gideon stared at her for a moment, then nodded slowly. Theoretically, yes. It would require reconfiguring the emission patterns, using the power cells as heat sources. I can do it, Sarah asserted. Systems modification was my specialty on the Artemis. Without waiting for his agreement, she removed one of the jammers from her pack and began manipulating its internal components, fingers working with precise efficiency despite the bulky gloves of her environmental suit. Gideon watched in silence, then began a similar process with one of his own devices. They worked quickly, aware that each passing minute increased the risk of detection. Sarah completed her modifications first, presenting the reconfigured device for Gideon's inspection. It will generate a heat signature approximately equivalent to a human body, she explained. Not sophisticated enough to fool detailed analysis, but sufficient to trigger initial detection protocols and confuse sensor sweeps. Gideon nodded, impressed despite himself. If we place them at diverging paths, moving in different directions. Exactly, Sarah confirmed. It won't buy us much time, but it might be enough to reach more favorable terrain. They deployed 4 modified jammers in total, setting them on automated movement patterns that would simulate human travel through the ruins. As the small devices disappeared into the swirling snow, following predetermined escape routes, Sarah and Gideon adjusted their own course, heading northeast through an industrial zone that offered better concealment. For the next hour, they moved in tense silence, pushing their physical limits to maintain distance from their pursuers. The storm intensified, visibility dropping to less than 10 meters at times. Under normal circumstances, such conditions would be cause for serious concern, but now they welcomed the additional cover the blizzard provided. It was Gideon who noticed the first sign of trouble with their own equipment. His suit's environmental controls began to fluctuate, internal temperature dropping noticeably despite the power still flowing to the heating elements. Something's wrong, he reported, checking diagnostic readings on his wrist display. The thermal regulation system is malfunctioning. Power flow is stable, but heat generation is decreasing. Sarah moved closer, examining his suit's external components for damage. There's ice forming on your primary circulation vents, she observed. The moisture from your exhalations is freezing in the extreme cold, blocking the heat exchange system. That shouldn't happen, Gideon muttered, clearly concerned. These suits are designed to prevent exactly that kind of failure. Under normal conditions, yes, Sarah agreed. But these temperatures are well beyond standard parameters. The design never anticipated sustained exposure to this level of cold. She worked quickly to clear the ice formations, but both recognized it was a temporary solution at best. The fundamental problem, the suit's inability to manage moisture in extreme cold, would persist as long as they remained exposed to the elements. We need shelter, Sarah stated, scanning their surroundings for viable options. Somewhere to perform proper maintenance on the suit systems. Gideon consulted his mental map of the area. There's a substation half a kilometer east, he suggested. Part of the city's original power distribution network. Underground, heavily insulated. If it hasn't been stripped by scavengers, it could provide temporary refuge. Sarah nodded, and they altered their course accordingly, moving with renewed urgency as Gideon's suit temperature continued to drop. The industrial landscape around them grew more desolate, processing facilities and storage structures rising like skeletal sentinels from the snow-covered ground. They located the substation entrance partially concealed beneath a collapsed loading dock. The access hatch was sealed with ice, requiring both their combined strength to break through the frozen barrier. Below, a steep stairwell descended into darkness, their suit lights revealing metal steps coated with frost. Gideon led the way down, his movements becoming increasingly stiff as his body responded to the dropping temperature within his suit. Sarah followed closely, worried about his deteriorating condition, but maintaining professional focus on the immediate task of securing shelter. The substation control room was a confined space dominated by now-silent equipment. Dust and frost covered every surface, but the essential structure remained intact. Most importantly, it was sheltered from the wind and significantly warmer than the surface environment. -15°C, Sarah reported, checking her environmental readings. Not comfortable, but manageable. Gideon nodded, already removing his helmet to assess the suit malfunction more directly. His face was pale, lips showing the first hints of blue that indicated the early stages of hypothermia. Sarah moved quickly to assist him, helping remove the upper portion of his suit to access the critical environmental systems. The primary heat exchanger is completely iced over, she observed, examining the sophisticated equipment with professional expertise. And the secondary system has suffered electrical damage, possibly from exposure to the extreme conditions. Gideon's expression was grim. Can you repair it? Sarah assessed the damage with methodical thoroughness. The primary system, yes. I can clear the ice blockage and implement a temporary modification to the moisture handling protocols. The secondary system is more problematic. It needs replacement parts we don't have. So I'll have one functional system instead of the redundant pair, Gideon concluded. Less safe, but workable. Sarah nodded, already gathering materials from their limited supplies to effect the repairs. You should rest while I work on this. Your body temperature has dropped below optimal levels. Conserve energy. Gideon looked as though he might argue, then seemed to recognize the logic in her assessment. He settled against one of the equipment cabinets, wrapping an emergency thermal blanket around his shoulders while Sarah began the delicate process of repairing his suit. They remained in tense silence for several minutes, the only sounds as soft clicks and scrapes of Sarah's work on the environmental systems. Finally, Gideon spoke, his voice quieter than usual. You could have left me behind. When the suit malfunctioned, it would have increased your own chances of survival. Sarah's hands paused briefly in their work, then resumed their precise movements. That wasn't an option I considered. Why not? Gideon pressed. It would have been the logical choice. Self-preservation. Sarah completed a particularly difficult adjustment before responding. My people have a different understanding of logic than humans often do. We don't separate survival from connection. One without the other is merely existence, not true living. Poetic, Gideon commented, but without the dismissive edge such a remark might have carried days earlier. But impractical in a world like this one. Perhaps, Sarah acknowledged. Or perhaps it's the only practicality that matters in the end. She sealed a final connection in the repair work, then tested the system's response. There, the primary environmental control is functioning again. It won't be as efficient as before, but it will maintain viable temperature levels as long as we don't push the system too hard. She helped Gideon resecure the suit components, both of them aware that their window of safety in this location was rapidly closing. The scavengers would have detected the failure of their decoy devices by now and redoubled their search efforts. How long until we reach the research facility? Sarah asked as they prepared to return to the surface. Gideon checked his navigation system. 4 hours at our previous pace. Longer if we need to evade pursuers or take detours. Sarah nodded, mentally calculating their resources and options. Your suit's limitations mean we'll need to move more cautiously, find shelter more frequently. 8 hours, realistically, which puts our arrival well after dark, Gideon noted grimly. Navigation will be more challenging, but the darkness might provide additional cover from detection. They completed their preparations in focused silence, each absorbed in private calculations of risk and survival. As Sarah secured the last of their supplies, Gideon activated a small device he'd extracted from a hidden compartment in his pack. "What's that?" Sarah asked, eyeing the unfamiliar technology. "Insurance," Gideon replied, cryptically, entering a complex sequence into the device. "If we're being tracked as actively as I suspect, we need to create more than just sensor distractions." The device emitted a soft chirp of confirmation, and Gideon returned it to his pack. "Let's go. We've remained stationary too long already." They ascended to the surface, emerging once more into the howling storm. If anything, conditions had worsened during their brief respite. Wind speeds had increased, and the snowfall had become so dense that visibility was reduced to mere meters. They activated locator beacons that would allow them to maintain visual contact with each other despite the blizzard, and resumed their journey toward the research facility. The next 2 hours passed in a grueling test of endurance. They moved as quickly as the conditions allowed, navigating through increasingly unfamiliar territory as they left the city's core behind and entered what had once been an outlying research district. Here, the buildings were spaced further apart, creating vast exposed areas they had no choice but to cross. It was during one such crossing that disaster struck. A sudden, blinding light cut through the storm from above, accompanied by the distinctive whine of military-grade repulsor engines. They had been found. "Split up," Gideon commanded through the comm. 20 meters, parallel courses. "They can't track both of us effectively in these conditions." Sarah complied instantly, veering away to establish the suggested distance. The aerial vehicle, now visible as a sleek, black craft designed for pursuit operations, adjusted its position, spotlights sweeping the ground in search patterns. "Keep moving," Gideon urged. "Don't stop, don't look back." They pushed forward, using what minimal cover the terrain provided, but the aerial vehicle maintained its position overhead, gradually closing the distance. Sarah realized with growing dread that their situation was rapidly becoming untenable. The craft was hurting them, using its superior position to drive them towards some unseen destination. Her suspicion was confirmed moments later when Gideon's voice came urgently through the comm. "Ground forces ahead. They've established a perimeter." Sarah assessed their options with rapid, tactical precision. "We need to break their containment strategy. Find a weak point in their perimeter and punch through." "Agreed," Gideon responded. "Converge on my position. We'll have better odds together." Sarah altered her course, moving to rejoin Gideon. As she did, the craft above suddenly banked sharply, its spotlight focusing intently on something in the distance. A tremendous explosion bloomed against the dark sky, momentarily turning night to day. "What was that?" Sarah demanded, instinctively dropping to a defensive posture. "My insurance policy," Gideon replied, a grim satisfaction evident in his tone. "Remote detonation of my living quarters. I set explosive charges throughout the structure years ago, as a last resort." "You destroyed your own sanctuary?" Sarah couldn't keep the shock from her voice. "Better that than letting Nexus Corp strip it for resources or intelligence," Gideon answered. "And it provides a useful diversion. The explosion will draw at least some of their forces to investigate." The aerial craft confirmed his prediction, veering away from their position toward the distant conflagration. In the momentary reprieve, they quickly assessed their situation. "The perimeter is still in place," Gideon reported, checking sensor. "Readings: 4, maybe 5 operatives in a standard containment formation." "Any weak points?" Sarah asked, scanning the terrain ahead. "Their eastern flank is thinnest," Gideon determined. "Probably assuming the storm itself is sufficient deterrent in that direction." The temperature drops significantly as we approach the old testing grounds. Sarah nodded, understanding the implication. "We go east, then. Push through their line where they least expect it." They set off immediately, taking advantage of the aerial vehicle's absence to move more boldly. The storm continued to rage around them, but now it was ally rather than obstacle, concealing their approach from the waiting perimeter forces. As they neared the projected position of the eastern flank, Sarah detected movement ahead, a dark figure barely visible through the swirling snow, heavily armed and attentive. She signaled to Gideon, and they dropped to prone positions, assessing the situation. "One operative that I can see," Sarah whispered through the comm. "Possibly others nearby. Standard perimeter spacing would put the next closest at least 50 meters to either side." Gideon nodded, then carefully removed a small cylindrical device from his pack. "Sonic disruptor," he explained. "It will temporarily incapacitate anyone within a 20-meter radius. Affects the inner ear, causes severe disorientation." "Will our suits protect us?" Sarah asked. "Partially," Gideon admitted. "We'll experience some effects, but nothing compared to someone directly exposed. Be prepared to move the instant I activate it." Sarah readied herself, checking her weapon and mentally mapping their path forward. Gideon activated the disruptor with a quick sequence of commands, then immediately threw it toward the position of the Nexus operative. The device detonated silently, no visible or audible indication of its activation except for the immediate reaction of the operative, who staggered and fell, clearly disoriented. Sarah felt a wave of dizziness wash over her despite the suit's protection, but pushed through it, following Gideon as he sprinted toward the gap in the perimeter. They were halfway to cleared territory when a shout came from their right. Another operative had spotted them despite the storm and disorientation. Weapons fire erupted, energy pulses cutting through the snowfall in deadly arcs. "Keep moving," Gideon urged, returning fire to provide cover. "Don't stop." Sarah complied, but adjusted her course slightly to support Gideon's position. They worked in coordinated movements, one advancing while the other provided suppressive fire, utilizing the limited visibility to maximum advantage. They had almost cleared the perimeter when Gideon suddenly stumbled, a strangled sound coming through the comm system. Sarah turned immediately to find him on one knee, one hand pressed against the side of his suit where an energy pulse had found its mark. "I'm hit," he confirmed, voice tight with pain. "Suit integrity compromised. Environmental systems failing." Sarah was at his side instantly, assessing the damage. The energy weapon had penetrated the suit's outer layer, damaging critical life support components. Already, frost was forming around the breach as the bitter cold infiltrated the compromised sections. "Can you move?" she asked, already calculating alternatives if the answer was negative. Gideon nodded grimly, forcing himself back to his feet. "For now, but the suit won't maintain viable conditions for long. Maybe 30 minutes before hypothermia becomes critical." Another burst of weapons fire drove them to cover behind a nearby structure, the remains of what appeared to be a security checkpoint for the research district beyond. Sarah returned fire, forcing their pursuers to seek their own cover. "The research facility," she said, mind racing through scenarios. "How much further?" 2 kilometers, Gideon replied, checking his navigation system with shaking hands, whether from pain or encroaching cold. Sarah couldn't tell. "Northwest from our current position." Sarah made her decision instantly. "We move now, maximum speed. Direct route regardless of exposure. Our only chance is reaching that facility before your suit fails completely." Gideon nodded, understanding the brutal calculation underlying her strategy. Speed over caution. The risk of detection and engagement versus the certainty of freezing to death in the open. No real choice at all. They abandoned their cover and ran, pushing through snow drifts and navigating around obstacles with desperate determination. Weapons fire pursued them initially, but the storm quickly swallowed them, rendering visual tracking all but impossible. Their pursuers would rely on technological means now: bioscanners, thermal imaging, motion detection, all compromised to varying degrees by the environment, but not eliminated entirely. Gideon's condition deteriorated rapidly as they progressed. The suit breach widened with movement, accelerating heat loss. His pace slowed despite obvious effort, his breathing becoming increasingly labored in Sarah's earpiece. "Leave me," he gasped after they had covered perhaps half the remaining distance. "I'm slowing you down. You have a better chance alone." "That's not happening," Sarah replied firmly, adjusting her position to provide physical support. "We started this together, we'll finish it together." "The data," Gideon insisted. It's too important to lose because of my failure. You haven't failed, Sarah countered, propelling them both forward through a particularly deep snowdrift. And neither have I. Not yet. They continued their desperate journey, each step a battle against both the elements and Gideon's failing strength. Sarah found herself drawing on reserves she hadn't known she possessed, her species' natural endurance, enhanced by determination that transcended mere survival instinct. The research facility appeared suddenly through the storm, a sprawling complex of low buildings surrounded by a high-security perimeter. Unlike the abandoned structures they had passed, this facility showed subtle signs of continued function. Minimal ice accumulation on certain surfaces, patterns in the snow distribution that suggested active environmental management. There, Sarah said, focusing Gideon's increasingly clouded attention on their destination. We're almost there. Stay with me. They approached the main security gate, which loomed before them like a monument to both hope and despair. Closed, sealed, forbidding, it presented yet another obstacle when Gideon's time was rapidly running out. Access controls, Gideon mumbled, gesturing weakly toward a panel at the side of the gate. Need authorization codes. Sarah helped him to the panel, supporting his weight as he fumbled with increasingly unresponsive fingers to input a complex sequence. The panel remained dark, unresponsive to his efforts. Power's out, he realized, despair edging into his voice. Backup systems must have failed. Sarah refused to accept defeat. Not when they had come so far, endured so much. There must be another way in. Emergency protocols, maintenance access, something. Gideon struggled to focus, drawing on deep reserves of will. Perimeter, not uniform. North side has a research tunnel. Separate systems. Might still be active. With renewed purpose, they skirted the main complex, following the security perimeter toward the northern edge. Gideon's condition continued to worsen, his movements becoming increasingly uncoordinated as hypothermia tightened its grip. Sarah was essentially carrying him by the time they located the research tunnel entrance, a reinforced door set into the side of a small outbuilding. Here, too, the primary access panel was dead, but Sarah noticed a manual override mechanism partially concealed beneath accumulated ice. With Gideon propped against the wall, she attacked the ice formation with desperate strength, clearing away frozen layers to reveal the emergency controls beneath. It needs physical key, Gideon observed, his speech slurring noticeably. Security measure. Prevent remote hacking. What kind of key? Sarah demanded, examining the mechanism closely. Standard. Federation emergency override, Gideon managed. All research facilities require by protocol. Sarah's heart sank. Such a key would be specific to this facility, likely held only by security personnel who had long since evacuated. Without it, the manual override was useless. Then a memory surfaced, something Gideon had said days earlier, when they were still strangers eyeing each other with suspicion across his living space. I was a lot of things. Before. Gideon, she said urgently, supporting him as he began to slide down the wall. Did you work here? At this facility? He nodded weakly, consciousness clearly fading. Environmental, engineering division. Before the collapse. Did you have access? An override key. His eyes, clouded with pain and encroaching hypothermia, briefly cleared with understanding. With trembling hands, he reached for a chain around his neck, concealed beneath his suit. The effort clearly cost him dearly, but he managed to extract a small metallic object. A key card, worn and scratched but still intact. Kept it, he murmured. After evacuation. Thought. Might need it someday. Sarah took the key with reverence, recognizing it for what it was, not just a means of entry, but a piece of Gideon's past he had preserved through years of isolation and survival. A connection to who he had been before the world collapsed around him. She inserted the key into the manual override, turning it with precise pressure. For a heart-stopping moment, nothing happened. Then, with a series of mechanical clicks and the groan of long-dormant systems activating, the door began to move, sliding sideways to reveal a dark tunnel beyond. It worked, she breathed, relief flooding her system. Gideon, we're in. But Gideon had slumped further down the wall, his eyes closed, breathing shallow. The suit breach had done its damage, the extreme cold infiltrating his body despite all their desperate efforts. Sarah wasted no time, gathering his now unresponsive form and carrying him into the tunnel, triggering the manual close mechanism as soon as they were inside. The darkness was absolute for several seconds. Then emergency lighting activated, casting everything in a dim red glow. The air was stale but noticeably warmer than outside, perhaps 10 degrees Celsius, Sarah estimated. Not comfortable, but significantly better than the killing cold they had left behind. She moved quickly down the tunnel, carrying Gideon with ease thanks to her species' enhanced strength. The passage sloped gently downward, leading deeper beneath the research complex. After approximately 100 meters, it opened into a larger chamber filled with abandoned equipment and monitoring stations. Signs of hasty evacuation were everywhere. Personal items left behind, notes still displayed on now-dead screens, coffee cups with residue long since dried to dust. Sarah located a medical station in one corner and gently laid Gideon on the examination table. Working with urgent precision, she removed his damaged suit, assessing his condition with growing concern. His skin was pale, with a bluish tinge of severe hypothermia, and his pulse was weak and irregular. Without immediate intervention, his chances of survival were minimal. The medical station, like everything else, had lost primary power, but some of the equipment appeared to maintain backup battery systems. Sarah activated a diagnostic scanner, relieved to find it still functional, if operating at reduced capacity. The readings confirmed her fears. Gideon's core temperature had dropped dangerously low, and the energy weapon had caused additional trauma beyond the suit breach. Working methodically despite her own exhaustion, Sarah initiated emergency treatment protocols. She located thermal wraps in a storage cabinet, activated their chemical heating elements, and applied them strategically to Gideon's core and extremities. An emergency medical kit provided basic medications to stabilize his condition, though Sarah had to adapt some treatments based on her knowledge of human physiology versus the specific formulations available. Throughout these frantic minutes, she maintained a steady stream of communication, speaking to Gideon despite his unconscious state. "Stay with me," she urged, administering a stimulant to help maintain his cardiac function. "We made it this far. We're safe for now. Just hold on." Whether her words penetrated his unconscious mind, Sarah couldn't know, but the act of speaking helped focus her own efforts, kept panic at bay as she worked to save the life of a man who, days earlier, had been a complete stranger. Gradually, the emergency measures began to take effect. Gideon's vital signs stabilized, though they remained concerning. His core temperature began to rise slowly, the blue tinge receding from his lips and fingertips. It would be hours before he regained consciousness, if all went well, longer if complications developed. Only when she was certain she had done everything possible for his immediate survival did Sarah allow herself to examine their new surroundings more thoroughly. The research tunnel appeared to be part of an environmental testing division, designed to monitor conditions outside the facility's maintained perimeter. Most systems were dormant, but some emergency functions remained operational on backup power. A status console near the center of the room still displayed active readings, though many sensors had failed over time. Sarah studied the information carefully, piecing together the facility's current state. The main power grid had indeed failed, as Gideon had surmised, but certain critical systems remained functional on an isolated backup network. Life support in key areas, minimal security functions, data preservation protocols. Most importantly, the central repository remained intact and operational. If this facility contained the data Gideon had suggested, records of the research conducted here before the collapse, it might provide crucial context for the information Sarah carried in her implant. Together, they might finally have enough evidence to prove deliberate sabotage rather than mere negligence. Sarah established a more permanent treatment area for Gideon, improving his thermal wrappings and connecting a steady supply of fluids and nutrients from the medical station's reserves. Once satisfied with his condition, she began a more thorough exploration of their sanctuary, methodically assessing resources, potential threats, and strategic advantages. The research tunnel connected to several other areas of the facility, most sealed off by security protocols triggered during emergency. Shutdown. Sarah found one access point still functional, a maintenance corridor leading to a small control center that appeared to have served as a backup monitoring station. Here, limited power remained available, enough to operate basic systems and potentially reactivate others if properly managed. Sarah spent hours familiarizing herself with the facility's infrastructure, cataloging available resources, and securing their immediate environment against possible intrusion. The Nexus Corp scavengers would eventually track them here. Of that she had no doubt. But the storm would delay them, and the facility's remaining security systems might provide additional protection if she could restore them to operation. Throughout these activities, she returned regularly to check on Gideon, monitoring his vital signs and adjusting treatments as needed. His condition remained stable but precarious, his body fighting to recover from both the weapon's damage and severe hypothermia. During one such check, she noticed his eyelids fluttering, the first sign of returning consciousness. "Gideon," she said softly, adjusting the thermal wrap around his shoulders. "Can you hear me?" His eyes opened slowly, unfocused at first, then gradually sharpening as awareness returned. He stared at her for several seconds, confusion evident in his expression. "We made it," Sarah explained gently. "We're in the research facility. You got us in with your access key." Recognition dawned in his eyes, followed immediately by an attempt to sit up that Sarah firmly prevented. "Easy," she cautioned. "You're still recovering." The cold did significant damage, and the energy weapon didn't help matters. Gideon relaxed back onto the medical table, taking in their surroundings with a scientist's careful observation. "How long?" he asked, his voice hoarse from disuse. "Approximately 14 hours since we arrived," Sarah replied. "You've been unconscious the entire time." "I've been busy." She gestured to the various systems she had managed to reactivate, the organized supplies, the security measures implemented at key access points. Gideon studied her work, then returned his gaze to her face. "You could have left," he observed. "Once you got me inside. Continued on your own." Sarah met his gaze steadily. "That wasn't an option I considered." A ghost of a smile touched Gideon's lips, so brief she might have imagined it. "The lone traveler sees the path, but misses the landscape," he murmured, echoing her words from days earlier. "Exactly," she agreed, adjusting his fluid delivery system with precise movements. "Rest now. We're as secure as possible given the circumstances, and you need to recover your strength." "The scavengers?" Gideon asked, fighting to remain alert despite obvious exhaustion. "No sign yet," Sarah reported. "The storm has intensified since our arrival. Even their advanced tracking systems will struggle under these conditions. But they'll come eventually. We should be prepared." Gideon nodded, then asked, "Have you accessed the central database yet?" "Not yet," Sarah admitted. "I focused on immediate survival needs and security first. The main data repository requires authorization I don't possess." "I can provide access," Gideon said, struggling once more to sit up. Sarah placed a gentle but firm hand on his shoulder. "Not now. The data has waited this long. It can wait a few more hours while you recover enough strength to actually be useful." This time, Gideon's smile was unmistakable, if still weak. "Has anyone ever told you you're remarkably stubborn for a systems specialist?" "Regularly," Sarah replied with her own slight smile. It was considered a valuable trait on the Artemis. Systems don't fix themselves, and they rarely cooperate with first attempts. "Like people," Gideon observed, his eyelids growing heavy despite his efforts to remain awake. "Very much like people," Sarah agreed, watching as he drifted back in a healing sleep. She continued her work, establishing defensive measures where possible, cataloging available resources, and preparing for the inevitable confrontation to come. The storm outside howled against the facility's exterior, a constant reminder of the hostile world beyond their temporary sanctuary. Hours passed, blending together in the unchanging artificial environment of the research facility. Sarah rested in brief intervals, her species requiring less sleep than humans, but still needing recovery periods after the extreme exertion of their journey. During one such rest, she was awakened by the sound of movement. Gideon, attempting to sit up on his own. She was at his side immediately, offering support rather than restraint this time, recognizing in his determined expression that further bed rest would not be accepted. "Stubborn," she commented, helping him achieve a seated position, a trait we apparently share. "Necessary for survival," Gideon countered, wincing as damaged muscles protested. "The movement, especially in this world." Sarah didn't argue, instead offering water and a nutrient compound she had prepared from the medical supplies. Gideon accepted both with muted gratitude, consuming them while surveying their surroundings with greater clarity than before. "You've been busy," he observed, noting the organized equipment, the reactivated systems, the strategic positioning of supplies, and potential weapons. "Preparedness increases survival probability," Sarah replied with the pragmatism of someone accustomed to emergency protocols. "Your condition has improved, but you're not fully recovered. We need to maximize our advantages before the Nexus teams arrive." Gideon nodded, then carefully swung his legs over the edge of the medical table. "The central repository," he said. "We should access it now, while we still can. The data it contains, combined with the information you carry, it might be worth more than either of us." Sarah didn't disagree, but cautioned, "You should regain more strength first. The repository has waited this long. And if the scavengers breach our position before I'm strong enough by your assessment?" Gideon challenged. "The data dies with us. Unacceptable risk." Sarah recognized the logic in his argument, much as she might prefer he rest longer. With careful movements, she helped him stand, supporting his weight until he found his balance. "The control center," he directed, taking experimental steps that grew more stable with practice. "Through the maintenance corridor. That's where we can access the repository systems." Together, they made their way through the dimly lit passage Sarah had explored earlier, Gideon's movements becoming gradually more fluid as his body remembered patterns long established. The control center, when they reached it, was much as Sarah had left it, emergency lighting casting everything in muted red hues, limited systems operational on backup power, workstations arranged in a semicircle around a central hub. Gideon moved directly to the primary console, his fingers finding the activation sequence with practiced ease despite the years since he had last operated the system. The display flickered to life, security protocols immediately engaging. "Authorization required," announced an automated voice, emotionless and precise. "Please provide credentials." Gideon placed his palm on a scanner beside the console, then spoke clearly. "Gideon Reeves, Environmental Engineering Division, Security Clearance Epsilon 7. Authorization code, Lazarus Protocol." The system hummed as it processed the input, scanning his biometric data and cross-referencing against stored records. After several tense seconds, the display changed, security barriers dissolving to reveal access to the core systems. "Lazarus Protocol?" Sarah inquired, recognizing the biblical reference, but uncertain of its significance in this context. "Restoration from death," Gideon explained, navigating through the system architecture with growing confidence. It was the designation for the facility's disaster recovery program. Ironic, considering how things turned out. He accessed a secure partition within the system, revealing a database structure of remarkable complexity. "This is it," he confirmed. "The complete research records of Project Meridian, the initiative that developed and maintained the atmosphere processors for all northern expansion territories." Sarah moved closer, scanning the data categories with professional interest. "That's extraordinarily comprehensive," she observed. "Design specifications, maintenance protocols, operational histories, everything needed to understand the processor network in its entirety. And to identify any deviations from standard protocols," Gideon added, his expression hardening. "Any unauthorized modifications or sabotage would be recorded here, even if the system operators weren't aware of their significance at the time. They worked methodically, Gideon navigating the familiar system architecture while Sarah applied her specialized knowledge of environmental support systems. Hours passed unnoticed as they immersed themselves in the data, cross-referencing operational logs with maintenance records, identifying patterns and anomalies that painted an increasingly disturbing picture. "There," Sarah eventually said, highlighting a series of entries from approximately 3 years before the collapse. These command sequences don't match standard operational parameters. They're subtle modifications to the atmospheric calibration algorithms, almost undetectable individually, but cumulatively significant. Gideon examined the flagged data, his expression darkening as he recognized the implications. They were deliberately programming instability into the system, he confirmed. Small adjustments that would compound over time, appearing as normal degradation rather than intentional sabotage. And the modifications originated from corporate headquarters, Sarah noted, tracing the command pathways, not from field technicians or local administrators. This came from the highest levels of Nexus Corp itself. But why? Gideon wondered, though his tone suggested he already suspected the answer. Why deliberately destabilize colonies they had invested billions to establish? Sarah accessed another data section, correlating the timing of the modifications with corporate financial records that were part of the facility's business operations archive. "Look at this," she said, highlighting a pattern of resource allocation decisions. As the processors began showing early signs of instability, Nexus Corp started redirecting resources away from economically underperforming territories and toward the megacity developments. They were consolidating, Gideon realized, the pieces falling into place. The outer sectors were becoming too expensive to maintain at previous standards. Rather than admit failure or invest in improvements, they engineered a natural disaster that would force evacuation and consolidation, while simultaneously positioning themselves as the saviors offering refuge in their megacities, Sarah added grimly. Creating a dependent population grateful for shelter, no matter how restricted their lives became under corporate governance. They continued their analysis, documenting the evidence meticulously, creating secure copies of critical data that could be transported if they were forced to abandon the facility. The picture that emerged was one of calculated corporate malfeasance on a planetary scale, sacrificing millions of lives and countless resources for the sake of centralized control and enhanced profitability. "This supports exactly what we found on the Artemis," Sarah confirmed, retrieving data from her secure implant and integrating it with the facility's records. The atmospheric degradation patterns we mapped showed accelerated decay in specific regions, precisely the ones Nexus Corp had designated as non-essential in these internal documents. Gideon's expression was grim but vindicated. "This is what I suspected for years, but could never prove. I saw the early warning signs when I was still working within the system, but my concerns were dismissed as paranoia. By the time the evidence became undeniable, it was too late. The collapse was already underway." Sarah placed a hand on his shoulder, a gesture of understanding rather than mere comfort. "Now we have proof," she said simply. "Definitive evidence that can't be dismissed or explained away. The question is, what do we do with it?" Before Gideon could respond, an alarm activated, a perimeter breach alert, its urgent tone cutting through the focused quiet of their research. Both reacted instantly, switching to the security monitoring systems to assess the threat. "Multiple intrusion points," Sarah reported, scanning the sensor readings. "Coordinated approach. The storm must have abetted enough to allow them to track us here." "Nexus Corp scavengers," Gideon confirmed, studying the tactical displays. "At least 3 teams. They're being thorough this time. No chances of us slipping away again." They quickly assessed their defensive options. The facility's security systems, though partially operational, had been designed to manage scientific confidentiality, not repel a military-grade assault. They had limited weaponry, restricted mobility due to Gideon's still recovering condition, and no viable escape route that wouldn't expose them to the lethal cold outside. We need to transmit the data, Sarah decided, already initiating communications protocols on the system. Get the evidence to someone who can use it before they reach us. Gideon nodded in agreement, but cautioned the facility's primary communication array is offline with the main power grid. The backup systems have limited range and security. The Artemis had contact protocols for independent settlements, Sarah explained, configuring the transmission parameters. Outposts beyond corporate control with their own communication networks. If we can reach even one of them. They worked with urgent precision, preparing data packets and establishing transmission protocols while simultaneously monitoring the scavengers' approach. The intruders moved with tactical efficiency, systematically securing sections of the facility as they closed in on the control center. Transmission ready, Sarah announced, finalizing the encrypted package containing their combined evidence. But I can't establish a stable connection with any of the independent outposts. The signal strength is insufficient. Gideon studied the facility schematics, searching for alternatives. There's a secondary communications array, he recalled, on the roof of the main research building. It was designed for deep space transmissions during the original terraforming operations. If it's still intact, it would have the power we need, Sarah concluded. But accessing it means crossing to the main complex, which means going outside. I'll go, Gideon stated immediately. You stay here, continue trying to establish contact through the backup systems. If I can reach the array and activate it, you'll only have a brief window to complete the transmission before they detect the signal and shut it down. Sarah shook her head firmly. Your condition doesn't allow for exposure to those temperatures again, even briefly. The damage you've already sustained makes you vulnerable to rapid hypothermia. I'll go. You don't know the facility layout, Gideon countered. You'd waste precious time navigating unfamiliar territory. Then guide me, Sarah proposed, already moving to prepare an environmental suit she had located during her earlier exploration. Through the communication system. You direct, I execute. Gideon wanted to argue further. She could see it in his expression, but practical reality overrode personal preference. His body, though recovering, wasn't capable of the exertion required, and time was running critically short as the scavengers methodically eliminated the distance between themselves and the control center. All right, he conceded, but we do this precisely. No unnecessary risks. The data is what matters. It needs to reach the right people, with or without us. Sarah nodded, understanding the implicit agreement to prioritize the mission over individual survival. She completed her preparations, ensuring the environmental suit was fully functional and the communication link with the control center secure. Gideon, meanwhile, established defensible positions within the control room, barricading access points and preparing what limited weapons they possessed. Their preparations complete, they faced each other one final time before Sarah's departure. Words seemed inadequate for the moment. They had moved beyond the need for verbal reassurances or emotional declarations. Instead, they exchanged a simple nod of acknowledgement, a silent recognition of a journey that had brought them from strangers to allies, to something neither could properly define. Ready? Gideon asked, his voice steady despite the circumstances. Ready, Sarah confirmed, securing her helmet and checking the suit seals one final time. She moved through the access corridor that would lead her to an emergency exit point, following Gideon's directions transmitted through her helmet's communication system. Behind her, she could hear him engaging security protocols to slow the scavenger's approach, buying precious minutes for her mission. The emergency exit opened onto a maintenance platform extending from the research tunnel's exterior access point. The storm had indeed abated somewhat, though conditions remained brutal. Temperature readings showed -38°C, with wind speeds at 20 knots. Visibility, at least, had improved to approximately 50 meters, enough for Sarah to identify the main research building's distinctive silhouette against the perpetual twilight sky. I see the target, she reported, securing a guideline to the exit point before venturing onto the ice-covered platform. Approximately 200 meters northwest, correct? Correct, Gideon confirmed through the comm. You'll need to cross the exposed research yard. There's minimal cover, so speed is your ally here. The main entrance should be on the east face of the building, a reinforced door with the facility logo. Sarah acknowledged the instructions and began her approach, moving as quickly as safety allowed across the treacherous terrain. The research yard was a frozen wasteland of abandoned equipment and collapsed temporary structures, all coated in ice that glittered faintly in the dim light. She navigated around larger obstacles, maintaining a direct path toward the main building whenever possible. Halfway across the exposed area, Gideon's voice came urgently through the comm. Movement at your 3 o'clock. One of the scavenger teams has reached the perimeter. They've spotted you. Sarah immediately adjusted her course, using an overturned research vehicle for cover as energy weapons fire erupted from the direction Gideon had indicated. The scavengers were too distant for accurate shooting in these conditions, but that advantage would diminish rapidly as they closed the gap. Continue to the main building, Gideon instructed, his voice tense but controlled. I'm monitoring their movements. 2 approaching from the east, 3 holding position at the tunnel entrance. If you reach the main complex, you can secure the entrance behind you. Sarah resumed her advance, moving in short bursts between available cover, the scavengers' weapons fire becoming increasingly accurate as they adjusted to the conditions. A pulse grazed her suit's exterior, the energy discharge momentarily disrupting the thermal regulation systems before emergency protocols. Compensated. Almost there, she reported, the main building's entrance now visible through the swirling snow. Extraction team, closing fast though. Might be tight. I've accessed what remains of the security systems, Gideon informed her. Ready to seal the entrance remotely once you're inside. The communications array is on the top level, central access shaft, then maintenance ladder to the roof. The array controls will be in a shielded housing marked with radiation warnings. Sarah acknowledged, making the final approach to the entrance at maximum speed, energy pulses from the pursuing scavengers striking the ground around her with increasing precision. She reached the reinforced door, finding it partially open. Whether from previous scavengers or emergency protocols during evacuation, she couldn't determine. I'm in, she announced, slipping through the gap and securing the door behind her. Immediately, she heard mechanical systems engaging as Gideon remotely activated the remaining security protocols, reinforcing her position. That will slow them temporarily, Gideon advised, but they have equipment to breach even reinforced entries. Move quickly. The interior of the main research building was a stark contrast to the tunnel complex they had occupied. Here, the evacuation had been more orderly, with equipment properly secured and emergency systems correctly engaged. Limited emergency lighting still functioned, casting long shadows through the cavernous entry hall. Sarah moved purposefully through the space, following Gideon's directions toward the central access shaft. Behind her, she could already hear the distinctive sound of cutting equipment being applied to the reinforced door, the scavengers working to breach her temporary barricade. The central shaft was a massive vertical corridor running the height of the facility, designed to accommodate the movement of large equipment between research levels. A maintenance ladder ran along one wall, extending upward into darkness beyond the reach of the emergency lighting. Beginning ascent, Sarah reported, securing her equipment and starting the climb. The ladder seemed stable despite years of abandonment, though ice had formed on some sections, requiring careful navigation. As she climbed, Gideon's voice came through the comm with increased urgency. The scavengers have breached the control center perimeter. I've implemented final security protocols, but it's only a matter of minutes before they break through. Understood, Sarah acknowledged, maintaining her pace despite the concerning update. Almost to the roof access. Status of the data package. Ready for transmission, Gideon confirmed. Encrypted and compressed. I'll initiate the moment you report the array is operational. Sarah reached the top of the ladder, finding herself facing a heavily insulated hatch leading to the roof. The manual release mechanism was frozen in position, requiring her enhanced strength to break the ice formation and engage the emergency override. The hatch opened with a groan of protesting metal, cold air rushing in as the pressure equalized. Sarah pulled herself onto the roof, immediately buffeted by wind significantly stronger at this elevation. The communications array dominated the center of the space, a complex arrangement of satellite dishes, antenna arrays, and signal amplifiers, all encased in ice but structurally intact. "I've reached the array," she reported, making her way to the control housing Gideon had described. Beginning activation sequence. The control panel was protected by a weatherproof cover that had preserved the critical systems from the worst of the elements. Sarah cleared the accumulated ice, then accessed the backup power controls, redirecting emergency energy reserves to the transmission systems. "Status update?" she requested, working methodically through the activation protocols. Gideon's response came through bursts of static, the communication system degrading as the scavengers disrupted the facility's remaining operational infrastructure. Control center compromised. Moving to secondary position. Data ready. Initiate when array online. The transmission was cut short by a burst of interference, then silence. Sarah worked with increased urgency, knowing Gideon was now directly engaging the intruders, buying time with his own safety. The array came to life with surprising responsiveness, dormant systems reactivating as power flowed through long inactive circuits. Status indicators shifted from emergency red to operational green as the sophisticated communication technology performed its automated diagnostic sequences. "Array online," Sarah announced, hoping the comm link still functioned despite the interference. "Ready to receive data package." For several agonizing seconds, there was no